We ended the first part of this story standing in front of a shape, a cube, a black cube that seemed to appear everywhere once you learned how to see it. In ancient temples, in modern cities, in religious rituals, in corporate architecture, in the silent geometry of power itself. In the first part of this series, we learned to look at Saturn not just as a distant planet, but as an idea, an archetype, a symbol that human beings have used for thousands of years to describe time, restriction, boundaries, law, consequence, and control. Saturn as the force that measures life, that divides it into hours and years, that tells you what is allowed, what is forbidden, and what the cost will be if you disobey. We learned that in conspiracy storytelling, Saturn becomes the ruler of the material realm, the god of the cage, the architect of systems that feel invisible but absolute, systems that reward obedience and punish instinct, systems that convince you the world you see is the only one that exists. And the symbol of that system, in this worldview, is the cube as container, the cube as box, the cube as a perfect prison. A cube has edges, corners, limits. It separates inside from outside. It is stable, efficient, orderly. And once you are inside it, everything makes sense in a narrow, mechanical way. Work, pay, obey, repeat. Live inside the schedule, live inside the rules, live inside the walls. In part one, the cube represented the system that trains you to forget your own vastness, the system that teaches you to shrink, to measure yourself by productivity, to define your worth by compliance, to accept the cage as reality. But every story about a prison eventually reaches the same question: how do you get out? This is where the second part of the story begins, because the cube is not a final shape. It only feels final when it is closed. A cube has 6 faces, 6 equal squares held together at right angles. When it is sealed, it looks solid, immovable, absolute. But a cube is not indestructible. It can be opened. And when you open a cube, something extraordinary happens. You do not add anything to it. You do not invent a new shape. You do not impose a symbol on top of it. You simply unfold what is already there. When you cut a cube along its edges and lay it flat, the 6 faces spread outward. 1 square remains in the center. 4 extend from it like arms. Another often rests above or below. What you are left with is no longer a box. It is a cross. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. The cross is the cube opened. The cross is what happens when containment is unfolded. The cross is not placed onto the cube from the outside. It emerges from within it. And once you understand that, the story of Jesus changes completely, because now the cross is no longer just an instrument of execution. It is a diagram. In this mythic and conspiratorial reading, Jesus is not simply a religious figure sent to appease an angry God. He is a symbolic interruption of the Saturnian system itself. The Saturn system runs on law, on punishment, on debt, on fear, on time, on guilt, on consequence, on the belief that you are fundamentally flawed and must be controlled. And the system demands sacrifice. Empires have always demanded blood to maintain authority. Rome perfected this. Crucifixion was not just execution. It was a public ritual of dominance, a message written in flesh. This is what happens when you step outside the rules. This is what happens when you threaten the order. Jesus was executed not in secret, but in the open. Not quietly, but deliberately. Not because he was weak, but because he refused to submit to the story the system told about itself. He challenged authority without becoming violent. He rejected hierarchy without building a new one. He spoke of freedom without seizing power. He treated the outcast as sacred. He forgave where punishment was expected. He refused to generate the fear the system needed to survive. In Saturnian terms, that is dangerous, because Saturn rules through consequence, and Jesus removed the teeth from consequence. When he was placed on the cross, the cube was being unfolded. The system did what it always does. It applied law, it applied force, it applied death. But something unexpected happened. The victim did not respond with fear. He did not beg the system for mercy. He did not curse his executioners. He did not attempt to overthrow the structure with violence. He did not justify himself to authority. He absorbed the system's violence without feeding it, and in doing so, exposed it. This is where the idea of paying for sins can be understood differently. What if sin is not moral failure, but entrapment? What if sin is missing the mark because the target was moved? What if sin is forgetting who you are because the system taught you to see yourself as small, broken, and indebted? In that case, the price being paid was not demanded by God, it was demanded by the system, and Jesus paid it by refusing to continue the cycle. The cross becomes the moment where the cube is laid open for all to see. This is why the story says the veil in the temple tore. The barrier between sacred and human collapsed. The architecture of separation failed. The box cracked. And then comes the part that terrifies systems of control. The resurrection. Because if Saturn is the god of time, then death is Saturn's greatest weapon. Everything dies, everything decays, everything ends. Except, in this story, something does not. The resurrection is not just survival, it is transcendence. It is consciousness no longer bound by matter, spirit no longer confined by law, life no longer owned by time. In Saturn Cube mythology, Jesus becomes the figure who escapes the box and shows others that escape is possible. Not through rebellion that strengthens the system, but through remembrance that dissolves it. This is why early Christianity was dangerous, not because it worshipped a man, but because it undermined fear. A population that believes death is not the end cannot be ruled the same way. A population that believes forgiveness overrides punishment cannot be managed by guilt. A population that believes the sacred lives inside them cannot be controlled by external authority. This is also why the message was eventually institutionalized, because symbols that liberate are always refolded into systems. The open cross was turned back into law. The living message was boxed into doctrine. The Saturnian pattern returned, but the geometry never stopped being true. The cube still unfolds into a cross, and the cross still represents the opening of containment. In this conspiracy worldview, Jesus is not the enforcer of Saturn's law. He is the interruption of it. He is the answer to the cube. He is the moment where the system reveals itself and loses its power. And that is why the story refuses to die, because it speaks to something people feel in their bones, that the world often feels like a cage, that life feels measured and managed, that something wild and sacred has been boxed away, and that freedom is not found by fighting the box, but by opening it. So the story ends where it began, with a shape, a cube that looks solid until you touch its edges, a cross that looks violent until you see what it reveals, and a question that refuses to go away. What if the prison was never the truth? What if the box was only a test? And what if the answer was not obedience, but awakening? Because if the cube can open, then the system is not absolute. And if the cross comes from within the cube, then freedom was always built into the design.